This time on Falmouth in Focus, echoes of the Revolutionary era. 250 years after To If by Sea set Paul Revere on his ride, the Founding Fathers' legacy rings out right here in our town. We're traveling back in time and climbing a steeple to get a bell's eye view of history on Falmouth in Focus, and it starts right now. Hello and welcome to Falmouth in Focus. I'm Michael Kasparian.
And I'm Eileen Preston. The shot heard round the world rang out not that far from us 250 years ago, commencing the battles that would win America its independence. You might call this moment bicentennial and a half. It's a chance to take a closer look at the history that quietly surrounds us and imbues our town with its character.
And with next year's anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence closing in fast, celebrations have gotten underway. A fife and drum squad from the Concord Museum made a guest appearance on the library lawn recently as local leaders commemorated Falmouth's call to revolutionary arms.
On April 13, 1775, Falmouth suffered the death of its beloved, long-serving minister, the Reverend Samuel Palmer. Just 1 week later, news came of the battles of Lexington and Concord. There was no time for sorrow or hesitation. Reverend Palmer's grieving son, Joseph, led the Falmouth militia to Barnstable, where they joined up with other Cape Cod militiamen at the Crocker Tavern. This unified force marched off to Marshfield to confront British forces stationed there. However, upon arrival, they found that the British had already retreated. They must have been fearful of those Falmouth people coming after them.
When he wasn't rousing the Minutemen into action on horseback, Founding Father Paul Revere worked with fire and metal. And he shared something in common with the gentleman standing here next to me. He was a Freemason.
Yes, he was. That's right. Many of the Founding Fathers were. And a lot of people may not realize it, but Paul Revere's work can be seen right at our lodge, including silver pieces he crafted with his own hands. So I'm standing in Marine Lodge, which is located right here on Main Street in Falmouth. This building was built in 1935, and most people don't even know that it exists. People walk by. We do have open houses from time to time. People walk in and they're kind of blown away. And so if you want to take a good look, I'll turn the lights on. You can take a good look at what the lodge looks like. It's not what anybody expects, and it's really a very beautiful and thoughtfully designed lodge. Lodges all are laid out similarly. Some are a little more grandiose than others. There's always an altar in the center of the lodge of which some of our ceremonies take place. The Bible is placed here. However, it's not always the Bible. We in this lodge are proud to have a diverse membership. We have Muslim brothers and Jewish brothers. In fact, we recently had someone of the Muslim faith become a member of our lodge, and anything associated with what he did was on a Quran. So I have the honor of being the current master of this lodge, and I sit here in this chair when I run the meetings. I have that honor until June, when the baton, if you will be passed to the next person. Our lodge has a very long history. We are the 25th oldest lodge in Massachusetts. We were chartered back in 1798, and we actually have the name of every person who has served as master in this lodge, beginning here with Frank Wicks, who was our first master in 1798, all the way to the other boards. And as of June, my name will be added to the end of that. When the lodge first applied for a charter, when the men of Falmouth decided they want to start a lodge here in 1798, Paul Revere, yes, Paul Revere, the Founding Father, was the Grand Master of all masters, of all Masons in Massachusetts. He was a silversmith. And so these are silver jewels. In particular, this case holds the jewels or the emblems of the officers of the lodge, and they were all crafted by Paul Revere. Actually, back in the late 1798, when we became chartered, these jewels were presented to the lodge and he actually made these for the lodge. Masonry came to the United States when, in the early part of the colonies, of course, it came over from England, and a lot of the officers and soldiers who were here, the British forces, wanted a lodge. There were lodges set up in Boston. Masonry began in Massachusetts in 1733. When you take the Sons of Liberty in particular, many of them were Masons, and they were Masons from across the colonies.
So, Michael, a little bit about Freemasonry. I think George Washington was a Freemason. Can you educate me a little bit about that?
George Washington was a Freemason, as were many of the founding fathers. Freemasonry is a fraternal organization, and it goes way back. And the signs are there in Washington, D.C., and a lot of cities through architecture and other, aspects of Masonry that are actually incorporated into the fraternity. So
the building, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And the whole point of Freemasonry is making good men better. And it's been happening here in Falmouth, as we saw, since 1789.
Building good men since 1789.
That's
All
right. With some help from Paul Revere.
Excellent.
Every hour we can thank Paul Revere for the sound that peals out across the Falmouth Green. It's his handcrafted bell that is rung out from the steeple of the First Congregational Church of Falmouth for centuries.
And that gives the church a strong incentive to take part in this year's 250th celebrations. At a recent event called Lyrics and Lanterns, Reverend Jonathan Drury used his sermon voice to paint a picture of Paul Revere and his times.
After describing some of the jobs Paul Revere held, including apprentice silversmith and, notably, amateur dentist, Mr. Kennedy writes, "The most interesting of Revere's many working endeavors, interesting because of what it illustrates about Revere's native temperament and because of its almost numinous foreshadowing of his singular act, the ride, is the job that Revere got for himself at age 15 as a change bell ringer at Boston's Old North Church. Change bell ringing is a particular skill. It came over to the colonies from England, where it began in the 17th century. A group of ringers, possibly as many as 16, and rarely fewer than 6, would stand in a circle. Each one of the ringers would have a rope in his or her hands. Each rope is attached to a different bell that is mounted above. And the bells get rung in succession, according to a precise, pre-established pattern, or sometimes as instructed by a leader who calls out the order of ringing in real time. Now, the Old North Church featured 8 bells, one of which bore, and still bears, the inscription, "We are the first ring of bells cast for the British Empire in North America." When Revere and the other change ringers rang those bells on a clear evening, a great part of Boston heard a waterfall of sound, a flowing pattern of discernible, individual notes that ran one into the next. And as best as anyone can tell, Revere and his cohorts were the first to ring those bells, or do any kind of change ringing on American soil. In 1795, Paul Revere established the first metal forge and foundry in America, just outside of Boston. And it was there that he became the first bell maker in America. Prior to the opening of Revere's foundry, all of the larger bells, those weighing 300 pounds or more, all of them were cast in England and then shipped to the colonies. Paul Revere made bells himself until 1811, which is when his sons took over the foundry. In 1796, Paul Revere sold the First Congregational Society one bell that was weighed at 807 pounds. And he sold his bell by their weight. And so on the receipt it says 807 pounds at the cost of 42 cents per pound, which cost the church approximately $338.94.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. You might remember those lines from school days. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote them almost 100 years after Paul Revere came down from his horse.
Historians have a few nitpicks about the exact accuracy of the poem, but nobody disputes the ability of Longfellow's lines to convey that feeling on that faithful night. Here's a little excerpt of the poem, read by Reverend Drury's wife, Jolie.
1, if by land, and 2, if by sea. And I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. His friend, through alley and street, wanders and watches with eager ears, till in the silence around him he hears the muster of men at the barrack door, the sound of arms and the tramp of feet, and the measured tread of the grenadiers marching down to their boats on the shore. Then he climbed the tower of the Old North Church, by the wooden stairs, with stealthy tread, to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch on the somber rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes in the shade. By the trembling ladder, steep and tall, to the highest window in the wall, where he paused to listen and look down a moment on the roofs of the town. And the moonlight flowed over all. Beneath, in the churchyard, lay the dead, in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear, like a sentinel's tread, the watchful night wind as it went creeping along from tent to tent, and seeming to whisper, all is well.
And now, to that bell up in the steeple that Paul Revere crafted about a quarter of a millennium ago. Local historian Greg Mills has studied the bell for decades and shared some insights with the Lanterns and Lyrics crowd.
This is a woodcut engraving that was first published in a book in 1839. And it shows the area of the village green of Falmouth. And in particular, it shows the building here, which was constructed by the First Congregational Church in 1796. This is the building into which the Paul Revere bell was first installed. The green at that time was not known as the green, it was actually known as the training field, for obvious reasons. That's where the residents of the town prepared to go into battle against the British did their training. This is the only image known to exist of that building. This was the church's fourth building, actually. The first two were in the vicinity of the old burying ground off Mill Road. This, of course, is the current church building, built here in 1857 across the street from the village green. The rectangular core of the 1796 building was moved on logs from the green to this spot and placed onto a new foundation made of West Falmouth pink granite. The church's front entrance was expanded and a newly constructed steeple was added, into which the Paul Revere bell was then reinstalled. These are the first steps that lead up from the balcony of the sanctuary up into the tower base.
But Michael, we're going to break into Greg's presentation at this point because this is where he showed some still pictures of the ascent into the belfry to see the Revere bell. We can actually go one better than that. Reverend Drury escorted FCTV on what he calls the mountain goat climb to the belfry. And we've got the special tour video for you now.
On this level, we now have the ceiling to the sanctuary. So if you need to go and change any of the lights that are above the chancel, you walk straight out until you get to the far wall, and then you'll find the fixtures in the floor, and you have to lift them up and switch them. This is also one of the features of the tour. Right here, you'll notice that we have a desiccated bat that got its foot caught. That's been there for at least 13 years now. You can see he's seen better days, but certainly a highlight of the tour. I don't think anyone has the gumption to remove them, tell you the truth. Step over the timber, and then you go right here. There's a little arch that you have to now bend down and go under, and that leads to another pipe that you have to step over. Now these are stairs, believe it or not. It looks like a ladder. You have to kind of enter from this side, and there is handrails, so I would encourage you to use the handrails. And there's the clock. And you'll notice at the top of the clock there are 3 metal shafts that extend outward from the clock. Each one of these metal shafts is attached to one of the clock faces. There's 3 clock faces on this clock. And then you have to kind of squeeze up through this door, and then once you're up in the belfry, there's plenty of room. And there she is. There's a number of notable things about the bell itself. You'll see that along the top there is this engraving. It says, "The living to the church I call, and to the grave I summon all." This really was Paul Revere's signature. You'll notice that the metal that was originally used to hold the bell has deteriorated quite a bit, but the bell itself is actually, in really good condition, considering it's fairly exposed to the elements. This bell would have been made from copper and tin and a few other alloys. And as far as we know, this is the 3rd bell that Paul Revere sold. And then we commissioned this bell in 1796. This bell weighs 807 pounds, which is notably larger than the first bells that he made. All of the other bells prior to Paul Revere's bells had been purchased in England and used in American churches. So Paul Revere was the first American bell maker. And as a result, we have the 4th bell that was ever made in America for churches. All of the carpenters who worked on this church, as far as we know, were probably employed down in Woods Hole as shipbuilders. And the shipbuilders understood that you really couldn't have a rigid structure if it was going to be in the air, if it was going to be affected by wind. And so they built this steeple so that you can see it has these metal straps that are kind of like holding it up a little bit like a cradle, and that allows this structure to move a little bit in the wind, especially above the belfry. It's pretty remarkable engineering. This bell no longer swings, but it had at one point. So you see there was this wheel that it would have been swung upon. Now it's mounted so that it's played with hammers, not with the pendulum that's on the inside or the ringer. This is the chime master. So this is the automated system that is now attached to the clock. That strikes the bell, and it strikes the bell the number of hours for every hour of the day. So if it's 4 o'clock, it strikes the bell 4 times, and it's 24 hours a day. This is the original hammer that was attached to the clock downstairs. And so I'm going to push it forward. You can see it's probably about 1/4 of an inch away from the bell. And this will demonstrate just how well this bell resonates. We absolutely feel like it's important to continue to have this bell ring over the town of Falmouth. It's been here since 1796, so that's a remarkable legacy. And this sound has now been heard for generations. So as caretakers of the bell, we feel it should be heard and appreciated.
So I think it's kind of magical that our town actually has Paul Revere's bell sitting over
Sure
the
is.
town, right? Ringing out. I think that's magical. I love it.
Yeah, it's really amazing that so much of the history of the nation started here in New England, in Massachusetts, and specifically in Falmouth. Played a really important role in having this Paul Revere bell, the Falmouth jewels of the Masonic Lodge, and it's just a wonderful way of, hearkening back and remembering, and makes this bicentennial and a half even that much more interesting for us.
Love it. And that's going to wrap up our show for the moment. I'm Eileen Preston.
And I'm Michael Kasparian. We'll be back soon with our monthly roundup of current events. Until then, We'll see you around town.